Okay, now this is the problem. I am letting people into the waiting room and about to begin. So here we go. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Jesse Zink. I'm here in the city of Montreal, Jojage, and I'm the principal here of Montreal Diocesan Theological College. And this is part of a series of conversations that we've done sporadically, but somewhat faithfully over the last couple of years, in which I, as principal, speak with an author of new and important books in the field of theology and of making our way as Christians in a changing world. And so this evening, I'm delighted to be joined here by Matthew Anderson, the Reverend Dr. Matthew Anderson. Matthew is a Lutheran pastor. He's a teacher. He's a writer. He's an author, as I said, and probably the thing we'll talk about a lot this evening is he's a walker and he's a pilgrim. So Matthew, it's great to have you here. Thanks for being here this evening.
It's great to be here, Jesse. Thanks for the invite. And it's nice to see so many familiar faces and names in the people who are attending this evening. It's wonderful to see fellow pilgrims and friends and others. Thanks for the invite.
Absolutely. And let me just say, before we turn to talking about Matthew and your writing this evening, let me just give a couple of technical notes and talk about how we'll proceed. As you can see, we're using the Zoom meeting function. And part of the reason we're doing that is that we hope this can be a conversation. I'll begin, and I have a introduction, and I want to lay the groundwork for some of Matthew's writing as an introduction for all of us, and I have some questions I want to ask. But we hope that if you have comments or questions that you want to make as well, there will be plenty of time for that, and there will be many ways to do that. I would say in this first part, while I'm asking questions and laying the ground, if you have comments you want to make, the best way to do that is in the chat screen. I'm sure by now many of you know how to use that. I'll just say that if you can type in the chat and everybody can see your question. Or if you have a question but you don't want to have your name attached to it, you can just chat it directly to me. And the way you do that is click in the three little dots in the upper right-hand corner of my face and click chat. And then I can give voice to your question, but your name won't be attached to it. We are recording this session this evening because some people have expressed an interest in this conversation. So we'll share the recording with those who have expressed an interest but aren't able to be here this evening. I would just ask that you stay muted until later on when we turn to a more conversational part. If you want to unmute yourself, that would be great, but it'd just be helpful to stay muted for now. So let me turn then. I want to share my screen here and tell you a little bit about Matthew Anderson and as our guest this evening. So as I've already said, Matthew is a Lutheran minister, Lutheran pastor. He's a New Testament scholar, has written a lot about St. Paul and Paul's epistles, and he taught here in Montreal for many years at Concordia University. And he now works as the Gatto Chair in Christian Studies at St. Francis Xavier University in Antigonish in Nova Scotia. And as I said, he's a pilgrim, he's an author, and he's a pilgrim. I've often said to Matthew that Matthew wins the award for the most productive author during the pandemic because coming out in recent years, Matthew's had a number of books, and we don't have time to talk about all of them, although I'm sure if there's questions, Matthew will take them. In 2021, Matthew published the book Pairings, the Bible and Booze, pairing biblical passages with certain drinks. In 2023, he published the book Prophets of Love, a book that was near and dear to the hearts of many Montrealers. The unlikely kinship of Leonard Cohen, Saint Leonard of Montreal, as some of us call him, and the Apostle Paul, looking at the overlap in their writings. But Matthews also explored and spent lots of time thinking about the relationship of settler descended people and indigenous people in Canada on Turtle Island. And this book, Our Home in Treaty Land, first came out in 2022, co-authored with Ray Aldred, who teaches at the Vancouver School of Theology, and republished in 2024. Let me just say, this is a not very long book. It's a great virtue of being a not very long book, and it's one that I use with my students because it's a wonderful introduction to conversation about the relationship of Christians with the land on which they find themselves. The book that I'll begin by speaking about this evening came out last year, The Good Walk: Creating New Paths on Traditional Prairie Trails, uh, from the University of Regina Press, published last year, and just won this year, uh, Matthew, you'll have to correct me, but a book award from the Creative Saskatchewan uh, organization. Is that right? Anyway,
Yeah,
award
it
winning
was the
for sure.
Saskatchewan Book Award.
Saskatchewan Book Award, yes, because as we'll hear, it's a book that in large measure is rooted in a particular place, is a book, well, we'll talk about this evening about what it means to learn a place in a new way through the act of pilgrimage. And Matthew's most recent book that just came out this year, Someone Else's Saint, about one of those wonderful saints, Saint Ninian, and how Saint Ninian, well, how a Scottish pilgrimage led to Nova Scotia. If you're not into reading, don't worry, Matthew's got you covered as well. Matthew is a wonderful multimedia academic here and has blazed the way in a number of ways. Matthew has done some video documentaries in the past, but one thing that I've connected with has been a podcast series that Matthew developed when we were all locked down during COVID, about Matthew's many pilgrimages, the Camino in Spain, St. Olaf's Way in Norway, and several others. So if you're looking for a podcast to listen to, the podcast Pilgrimage Stories from Up and Down the Staircase is, well, perhaps that's for you, and it's a way into thinking about some of the themes we'll be talking about this evening. So let's see, Matthew, what else am I missing in my introduction of you?
That's pretty good, I'd say.
Well, and I mean, I'll ask this question later, but what's the next book is always the next question. But hold your answer now. We'll whet people's appetite. I want to start by asking you this question about The Good Walk, and about the book, about the first line of this book is this: Canada needs new stories. And this is a book that is really grounded in a particular place, namely Saskatchewan, which is where you were born and raised. So I wonder if you could begin by telling us about the place where you were raised, how you understood that place and that land, and the stories that you grew up learning about that place in southern Saskatchewan.
Sure. One of the things I like to say, thanks, Jesse. One of the things I like to say is that I was raised in Treaty 4 territory, but never ever heard the words Treaty 4. So that says something right there about the way I was raised.
And
Um,
and tell us what you mean by Treaty 4 in that
so
context.
Treaty 4, the across what's I would say central Canada, across the plains, the prairies, and then further up into the north, there were a number of treaties, and still are, but there were the so-called numbered treaties. So one, two, three, four, all the way up to nine, I believe, uh, were signed and negotiated by the Canadian government between, around 1740 or something to right through until the 1900 and some, I think. And there, of course, the government is still negotiating treaties. There are still treaties being negotiated, but I think the numbered treaties count from that period of time. And I grew up in Swift Current, Saskatchewan, which is Treaty 4 territory. And I was very also familiar also with Treaty 6 territory, which starts north of Swift Current and goes up toward Edmonton, we'll say, that sort of swath of Saskatchewan and Alberta. So I grew up on the prairie, and but I lived so many years in Montreal that I have thought of myself as a Montrealer, where you are, for many, many years. But I think I say something in the book about I was out wet. My wife, Dr. Sarah Parks, and I were in BC, and we were picking up something from a place in BC, and and the person said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Montreal." And Sarah said to me, "No, you're not." And I said, "What do you mean? I'm from Montreal." And she said, "Really? Are you from Montreal?" And this poor clerk was standing there with the change in her hand, waiting to give it back to us. Fortunately, there was nobody else at the cash. And Sarah and I get along super well. This was not an argument, but Sarah said she was really quite adamant. She said, "When you close your eyes and you think of home, what kind of land do you see? And I've always remembered that because that was a really wise point. When you close your eyes and you think about home, what kind of a landscape or cityscape it might be, comes into your mind. And I had to admit that when I close my eyes and I think about the word home, still somehow after many, many years of being away from it, I think about the prairies, the coulees. I think about the Caragana bushes. I think about the big skies. I think about the kind of the rolling land that almost rolls off like an ocean into the distance. I was formed by that kind of land. And like many, many Saskatchewan people, I mean, Swift Current is not a small town. It's a city of maybe 18,000 now, but it definitely has an edge. When you're in BC in the interior of British Columbia, or you're, somewhere around Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa, you never really get away from human habitation completely. And by the way, that's not even, I live in the country here in Nova Scotia. And Sarah, I was worried when we moved here. We bought the house from Ireland, sight unseen. And I was a bit nervous moving here because I knew we were living in the country. And Sarah kept trying to understand why I was nervous. And then when we got here, and when she first saw Saskatchewan, she said, "No, now I understand. The neighbor could be 10 miles away in Saskatchewan." And I was nervous about that kind of isolation. But it is really rare in Saskatchewan where you can walk to the edge of the town and step out onto the prairie and not see any, well, you can see human signs of human activity, but not see any people or necessarily any buildings in your whole line of sight for miles. And so I grew up in that kind of a land, and you learn something from the wind, you learn something from the land, you learn something from the solitariness of that kind of a landscape. And I think it formed me, and is part of the reason for the book.
And what kind of stories did you learn about that land? I mean, you talk in this book about how your family's relatively recent immigration history to Canada, but also tying in with the history of the West, of words like settler and pioneer being
Yeah.
words that are positive. So, what kind of stories are being told about that land that you're learning about as you
Well,
as you as you're raised there?
I'm of the generation that grew up playing cowboys and Indians, and I was always a cowboy. Nobody wanted to be the Indian. The stories that we were told about family were, embodied by the portraits on the piano. Houses don't necessarily have pianos anymore, but again, part of the generation, there was always a piano that was often not used in another room, and on top of it were old pictures of settlers or of pioneers, as we called it. And in Swift Current, the exhibition days are called Pioneer Days. They're still called Pioneer Days. So I walked up and down the stands at Pioneer Days selling Cokes and hot dogs and stuff to the people in the bleachers or sitting in the bleachers myself. And so it was Pioneer Days. I went to the Pioneer Co-op, which is still there. And it was always Pioneer. Pioneer was a really good word in Swift Current, Saskatchewan. And nobody said settler, everyone said pioneer. So I never thought about the connection between the fact that a pioneer comes to a place. Well, we were kind of taught that the land was empty. And it was not so much that we were explicitly taught that, but that was the impression we were given, and nobody ever changed that impression. And my parents probably thought somewhat similar things, but they had the evidence even closer to them of the ways in which it was empty because it had been consciously emptied by the government. And I
Mhm.
never knew that until I was, almost 50.
Mhm. So I would say this book, I mean, you say this, as I say at the beginning, Canada needs new stories. Part of this book is about you coming to learn a new story that has to do with this land. So I guess
Yeah.
there's two questions there. One is, tell us about what that story is that you learned, but then tell us how you came to learn that story.
Yeah. Well, the book is both kind of academic and very personal. It really does combine those two, I think. And the personal part was that I wrote it I started writing it and started the walks, primarily the walks out west. So it's about these massive walks that we took that are still have evolved into another thing, but are still going on really. So the first walk was in 2015 from Wood Mountain, Saskatchewan, which is just north of the border, south of Moose Jaw, so in the middle of the province, pretty much. So Wood Mountain, Saskatchewan to Cypress Hills, which is in the southwest corner. So, pardon me, about 350 kilometers roughly. And we walked that in 2015. And at times it was just me and Hugh Henry, whom I'd like to, pay tribute to a little bit as we talk. And then in 2017, a larger group, walked from Swift Current north to Battleford, Fort Battleford, Saskatchewan. So that was kind of north, making a 90-degree from the previous walk. And Fort Battleford was very important to also the founding of the Northwest Territories / Saskatchewan. And then in 2018, we walked the Frenchman Trail. So those were the three walks that we took. And the your question again, Jesse,
Well,
was,
so I mean that's the how you learn the story.
yeah,
You learn the story
oh,
by walking, and I said in my introduction, I think you are a walker. I can't
yeah,
imagine how many pairs of boots you've worn out
a few.
over that time. But what was the story you're learning? And you
Oh,
mentioned the place Cypress Hills. I mean, that's a place that you write about in this book in terms of how you come to learn a new story about what happened there. But t tell us about the story you're learning about the land through the walking.
yeah. So through the walking, you learn a few things just really, really physically. And one of them is how densely the prairies were populated by indigenous peoples before the arrival of, say, my grandparents. And my grandparents came around the same time as everybody else. So very early in the 1900s, there had been settlement before that, but it really hadn't been. It started in earnest in that bit of land around 1880, 1890. So within 15 years, my grandparents were there. But I grew up thinking that it was empty, but when you walk it, you realize you begin to see lodgepole rings, so teepee rings everywhere. And at first, we were all excited seeing these teepee rings, and then at some point, we realized they're everywhere. And you don't see them because you're in a car, you're on a road. They've been disrupted by agriculture. But really, every time that you walk on land that has not been disrupted by plowing and cropping, you see very dense, in every high place, in every kind of amenable place for a settlement, you see very dense teepee rings, which show the evidence of thousands of years of fairly dense indigenous habitation. And so Saskatchewan, oddly enough, we talk about it being settled, but in fact, it's been unsettled in the sense that it's been emptied out and stayed, relatively empty compared to the kind of populations that moved through it pre-settlement. So that was one thing I learned. That was one of the news stories that I learned. I also learned news stories about the interactions between indigenous peoples and settlers. So, for instance, Cypress Lake is a beautiful little lake outside of Cypress Hills, and I grew up water skiing on that lake and fishing on it. And so my father would take me fishing, my brother and I fishing there, and we'd fish for pike and perch and jackfish. But anyway, what I learned only fairly recently is that there were thousands of people who starved to death either at the shores of that lake or around that lake in the winters of around 1880, 1881. And this is described by Jim Daschuk in his book Clearing the Plains, but I talk about it also in The Good Walk. And the government of Canada had a relief depot when the bison were extirpated. The government set up a relief depot at Fort Walsh in Cypress Hills, and then shut it down in January. Now, anybody who's been in Saskatchewan in January, and then told the people that if they wanted food, they could walk to Frog Lake or Battleford, which is several hundred kilometers north. Can you imagine walking without shelter, without clothing as a family in Saskatchewan across the prairie in a January? I mean, it's inhuman. So that's one of the things that I learned. And obviously many people died, if not because they were already weakened by starvation and then facing that kind of incredible cold, 40 below, and not even wearing proper clothing or having proper shelter at night, or proper nutrition. So I learned those kinds of stories as well. There needs to be there's a kind of a that's not the stories I learned. I learned about brave settlers. I learned about my grandparents who came without, it's always the $20 in their pocket. They came with, and they did. I'm sure that they were brave, and I'm sure that I remember my grandparents, they were very resourceful, very hardworking, as so many pioneers were. But but that's only learning a little bit of the story. That's not learning the part about how the land came to be empty to prepare it for them. And there's a kind of a complicit silence that went on there that my family was a part of, as almost every family was and is.
So well, there's a couple questions I want to ask, but let me just follow up on one thing you just said. You mentioned the name Hugh Henry,
Mhm.
but I think I just want to underscore that these were not walks that you just did by yourself. You didn't just sort of set out across the prairie, nor did you, come to learn all this history by yourself, or So tell me about the kind of community that you were a part of that was engaged in these walks. I mean, it's both indigenous people and non-indigenous people as well, and how that community was part of the learning and the story learning that was going on during these walks.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out because it's really important. I'm not a solitary pilgrim. Like I'm not one of those kind of Cheryl Strayed people who sets off and then tells a story about their heroic. And there's nothing wrong with being a heroic adventurer, but I wouldn't say that almost any of my pilgrimages have been that kind of solitary heroic adventure. I like walking with people. I like talking with people, and I like learning from people, as you just pointed out. And we were lucky enough that so Hugh Henry, I'll just say right away. The other thing is I'm an academic, maybe first and foremost, and so I'm a little bit useless at some things, even while I'm good at other things. And so for instance, I had this idea of walking across the prairie, and it was my idea. It's true. I had this idea. I thought, well, let's walk across this road. I didn't even really know where I was going or what I wanted. And then I contacted this group called the Saskatchewan History and Folklore Society, wonderful group. And they put me in touch with Hugh Henry. And Hugh Henry he was the godsend, frankly, to all of these walks on the prairies, because um, if it had not been for Hugh, I would have been wandering around in circles on the prairies, for a couple of days until I got hungry. And if I was lucky, I would have found my car and then gone home. But Hugh actually knew the land. He knew, he made contact with many of the farmers and ranchers in the area. He already had an idea of a trail, which had a whole history. And then he didn't necessarily know all of the deep history that I was able to then to find out as an academic, but it was a really good symbiosis because he really did so much of the practical planning, and then he had a sense of the land, having grown up a farm boy and walked across it so many times and driven across it so many times. So he was invaluable and still is a great friend of mine, and still organizing or being a resource person for these walks. And then the other person at the very beginning that I was lucky enough to get involved with, I'm actually wearing a badge. You probably can't see it, but I don't know. I should take this off and point it. This is Richard Kotowich. Now, I wear a badge for him because time. This badge was produced when he was not doing well. He was dying. No, you can't see that because of the
Yeah, there we
yeah
are. Yep, that's good.
yeah yeah. So Richard Kotowich was a Métis educator in Saskatchewan, and he was a fantastic man. He died just before the book came out, sadly, but he did see the proofs for it, and he did write the introduction for it. And Richard was fabulous. He became kind of our de facto elder on these walks. He led us in smudges every day. He was not necessarily the only Indigenous person, but at the beginning he was. He was kind of, it was me and Richard and Hugh, sometimes just the three of us or Hayden Thomason, who was a student at Concordia, who came along for a walk. But he was a big part of the education because Richard really continually and softly taught us different ways of doing things, ways of taking time for glacial erratics if we saw a big rock and taking and honoring the spirit of a place. How to establish relations with farmers and talk gently about colonization, even how to ceremony, which anyone who has maybe there may be indigenous folks on this Zoom meeting, and if so, they probably already know all about this. But for those of us who are not, ceremony is a kind of diplomatic protocol, very often amongst indigenous peoples, and certainly for the Nahiao, the Cree, and for Richard, there was a ceremony. There was a proper way to do things. A good, and that in fact is where the book title comes from, The Good Walk. It's kind of a pun because it was certainly a long and good walk in the sense of, boy, you couldn't get a better walk than that. But it was also that this was we were smudged by an elder at Wood Mountain Lakota First Nation as we first set out in 2015. And he said to us, go and walk the good walk. And that is the idea, meaning the right way to do it. Do it in the right way. And that means respecting the land, respecting each other, and learning, especially as settlers, learning from the land something about our own history. So I probably veered way off that question, but
Well, as somebody who didn't grow up on the prairies, one of the learnings that I took away from this book is that it's possible to get lost on the prairies quite easily.
oh,
In fact, as somebody whose main experience of it is driving across it on roads,
yeah.
you realize actually it's not totally flat. And as you say, it's possible to quite easily end up walking in circles or to get separated from your group. There are some kind of funny moments that you describe in this book. So,
Yeah,
yes,
we did. We occasionally did get separated from each other, and that was always interesting.
yes. Let me just pause and say that Uh, I'm gonna keep asking Matthew some questions here, but I do see one or two questions that have come directly to me, and I'll give voice to those in due course. But if other people have questions they want to ask, we'll open it up to voicing questions in a little while. But if you have particular things, you can use the chat thread right now. So all of this has been background, talking about stories, talking about the place and the land as you first grew up, knowing that place and the stories that went with that land, and then coming to understand the place through learning new stories. Uh, you use a couple of interesting words, and one word that you use in the Good Walk is the word unhomeness.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah.
Unhomeness. And I wonder if you can say what you mean by unhomeness.
Yeah, that's kind of one of those academic things that I gave a paper one time on unhomeness. It's the idea that we have, in order to, for Canadians, and I, don't mean to speak for Americans, but probably the same thing for that. Um, but unhomeness is a way of making ourselves strange to our identities again. So I talked about how I grew up in Swift Current in Saskatchewan, and that place was home. When I think about those plains, I think about those hills. But at the same time, in order to change the narrative of your identity and who you are, in order to grow into a new understanding, a new story that includes Indigenous peoples and actually understands their primacy on the land and their sovereignty, their ongoing sovereignty, you kind of have to go through an unhomeness. I mean, adolescents do that, right? When in our culture at least, quite often adolescence is a kind of an unhomeness from your family. You go away from your family briefly so that you can come back, one hopes, if you're a parent, that you can come back and reintegrate as an adult. So there's a kind of it's not necessarily going away completely, but there is a kind of a learning a separation, developing the separation and learning what that means. And so for me, unhomeness, which can really happen in pilgrimage, walking across land is a way of developing new relations to the land that may be strange at first. So for me, seeing the teepee rings everywhere was a shocking realization that made what I thought was familiar at first seem unfamiliar briefly before I could then find myself in it again. I hope that answers that.
Yeah, well, and
It's Freudian, actually.
sorry, it's
It's
Freudian.
it's from Freud, yeah.
Okay. Interesting. I didn't pick up on that, but you just used the word pilgrimage. So, t tell us, I mean, this is, I know, getting very close to what, you're so passionate about. So I mean, what is pilgrimage? But really, how does this idea of movement of pilgrimage relate to that unhomeness? Like what's the connection? Why do you have to be in movement to learn a place anew like that?
Well, anybody who's gone on a long walk or a long bike trip probably would be the same. I know you're a cyclist. Um, a long walk or a long bicycle trip knows that you become reduced to certain basic things. So if you're carrying a backpack, all of a sudden your bottle of water, your feet, like the shoes that you're wearing, your the one raincoat and the one fleecy that you have, a fleece, they all become incredibly important. And I've never met anybody who came back from a long trip who didn't say, why do I have all these things in my house? I lived for whatever it was, 3 weeks or a month or something out of a backpack or a suitcase, and I realized that I can live on only those things. So pilgrimage is a way of experiencing that kind of Spartan or spare kind of life. And this says principal meets author or principal talks to
Mhm.
author, but it really should be author talks to author because you say one of your principles in your book, Faithful, Creative, Hopeful, one of your theses is that attentiveness we offer attentiveness, Christianity offers attentiveness to a distracted people. And I think that pilgrimage does the same. And often that's combined, Christian pilgrimage. But it offers attentiveness to our distractions and helps us to focus by limiting the stimuli that's coming in. And certainly when you're walking, I often say that when you're walking a long distance, any kind of distance over, say, half an hour, frankly, you get bored. And that's not a bad thing. It's the boredom that then leads you to start other things. Like there's kind of a meditation that comes out of the silence and out of the ennui, out of the boredom of setting one foot in front of another. And what happens? You learn about your aching right ankle that you never really thought about before. Maybe you start thinking about that conversation you had with your relative yesterday, and at first, it's a bit worrisome because you're going, oh, I should have said this or something. But then eventually you start focusing on that person. So there's a whole meditation that can come up. And the thoughts that bubble up as you walk are gifts to us that we, in our distracted world, rarely take the time to receive, I think. So that's one of the great things about pilgrimage.
Yeah. K- we began this conversation. You were talking about being on Treaty 4 land,
Yep.
and yeah, the other book that I mentioned, I have the earlier version of it here, Our Home in Treaty Land, which I presume that title is meant to be. Oh, that's the new version right there. Okay.
Yep.
I presume that title is meant to be a play on Our Home in Native Land.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, you talk about in both books, both The Good Walk and Our Home in Treaty Land, you talk about the importance of being on treaty land, and
Yeah.
what treaty symbolizes, and about the importance of sharing land. That I think in one of the, I think it's in The Good Walk, you talk about, treaties, indigenous people made treaties not to surrender land, but as a testament to sharing land, as a way of sharing land. And how does that tie into this, I guess? How do you come to understand land as being treaty land? And how does that change your approach or to thinking about this?
Yeah. Um, Well, I mean, these walks took place during the final days of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so the recommendations of the commission came out around the same time as these walks took place. And by the way, on a personal level, as my parents were dying, and I was kind of involved with their final days and their legacies. So it all kind of comes together in an organic way that way. But yeah, the Ray, who wrote the Our Home and Treaty Land with me, Ray Aldred, he brought a very interesting. I mean, he's a Christian, and so um, he talks about the treaties as the creation story for Canadians, which I think is very profound. He says, "This is your creation story." Canadians are always worried about their identity. He said, Canadians are always, trying to figure out who they are. He said, "Well, here it is. You're treaty people. You came, your ancestors, or your governmental ancestors at least made treaties with ours. And so that became your creation story. From wherever you came and where people still come from, the creation story is the treaty that allows you to share this land." And as a Christian, I really I guess I understood that. That was a really great teaching for me, one of many from Ray, frankly. And so as when you walk, you are kind of I've also met, by the way, I've met Indigenous people who do not like the idea of a group primarily of settlers walking across the land, because they say, "What are you? Are you kind of inspecting your property that you stole from us, or what?" But if it's done properly with Indigenous guidance and help, and if it is done in a spirit of treaty, then and it's advertised that way, I guess, then I think it is a good way of understanding how the land is part of our relation. And that is the other bit about Our Home and Treaty Land, is that treaty establishes relation where previously there was none, and it's meant to establish good relation. And historically, um, you can tell that the government of Canada um, did not always have that proper idea of establishing relationship. And, in some ways, the different groups that made treaty with the government of Canada were making relatives. They were saying, now we are brothers and sisters, now we're cousins, now we're part of the family. And the government representatives in many cases were saying, okay, now we can put you on a reserve and we can exploit this land. So it's a very different understanding of land. And in these fraught climate times, we're starting to realize that our ancestors' view of land as neutral, something to be possessed, to be exploited, rather than a relative to be in relationship with, is not necessarily the healthiest for the planet. So all
Mhm.
of these things you learn partly on pilgrimage. I mean, you can learn them apart from that, but
So there are I'm going to ask one more question and then I'm going to give voice to a number of the questions that are coming in. So let me just I think because it follows up on what you just said,
yeah,
Matthew. In the Good Walk, you say this. In recent years, I've been struck how the basic ingredients of a pilgrimage are similar to four things that many indigenous writers identify as important simply to being human. So you're struck by how the basic ingredients of pilgrimage are similar to many things that many indigenous writers identify as important simply to being human. And the four things are land,
yeah,
relations, spirituality, and stories. So I think land, relations, spirituality, and stories you think are important to pilgrimage and constitutive of how indigenous people understand human identity. So I think we've spoken about some of those things, land, relations you were just speaking about, stories we began by speaking about. But I mean, maybe I'd ask you specifically to speak about the spirituality piece, and how you think that fits into this story as well.
yeah. Well, one of the maybe one of the benefits and problems of Christianity. I'm a biblical scholar. I'm not a theologian, but Christianity has always had this odd um, push-pull with land, because in one sense, by being universal, it and having its sort of eye on the heavenly Jerusalem, it claims no land supposedly, even though Christians have been pretty good at claiming very specific land. But at least ideologically, the idea is that Christianity is universal. Our um, our home is in God's reign when that happens in a transformed society, and therefore specific locales have been in the Christian imagination identified more with a certain kind of paganism or even a pantheism or something like that. So not an attachment to land, but it was that divorce from land in some ways, an artificial divorce from land that allowed the kind of capitalist exploitation that's caused so many problems now. There is a healthy way, I think, of seeing land and our beliefs as to having a spirituality, a Christian spirituality attached to land. And I think that's why so many people have been attracted to the sort of pseudo Celtic. Like I'm not trying to slander Celtic spirituality, but there are a whole bunch of people who buy into a kind of a it's really it's not real Celtic spirituality. But if you go back in to the time of Saint Ninian, for instance, or of a Columba or of Patrick, you see that whether or not you were Celtic, you could also be Anglo-Saxon. Any early Christian society that was really attached to the land, Hildegard of Bingen,
Mhm.
they all have a kind of a spirituality of creation, Francis of Assisi, that we can learn from. And it's by spending, really part of it is by spending more time. The thing that we haven't talked about, but you know very well, and many of the people who are here know about very well, is that when you get out of a car and you turn off the radio and you walk across any land, doesn't matter where it is. It could be here in northern Nova Scotia, could be North Bay, Ontario, it could be somewhere in Burnaby, BC, it could be on the island. When you get out and you walk, then what happens is that you begin to see things that you cannot see in the cocoon of a vehicle or in the cocoon of some kind of public transit or whatever it might be. And that will, if it's wedded to spirituality, help us to appreciate God's creation in somewhat similar ways to the ways that these ancient Celts or the Anglo-Saxon farmers or indigenous people until recently. I mean, not all indigenous people are like that's its own problem if you romanticize indigenous people, but at least until contact, and still in many ways, many indigenous people have a closer tab on creation than we do because of that. And pilgrimage is kind of one way into that. It's not the only way, but it does allow that kind of forest bathing or nature bathing that allows us to form those kind of spiritual attachments. God gave us this creation, and we spend time in it, and we see also that it's lovely, but also it can be terrible, it can be frightening, it can be difficult, and that's also a part of an honest spirituality of creation.
Hmm. Okay, so I'm gonna pause my questions right now, and I'm gonna give voice to some of the questions that have come in the chat, both to me privately, but also the ones that are to the group. But if there are people who want to use their own voice to give voice to a question, the best way to do that right now is to use the raise your hand function, because I can't quite see everybody, and some of you have your cameras off. But if there's a question or a comment that you want to make, use the raise your hand function. But Matthew, this is a question that came directly to me, but I think it's echoed by some of the things in the public chat as well. And that question is, um, how do you get started on something like this? You've just described several 100-kilometer treks across the prairie. Um, but what are things closer to home or perhaps not quite as logistically intensive? How did this begin for you? Or what advice would you have for people who are interested in something similar in terms of relating to the land in a new way?
Well, for short walks, you can just step out your door and go walking. That I think is the main thing. When I was in Montreal, I would often walk from Concordia University downtown, pardon me, to Verdun. Now, that's not a pretty walk. That's it's got its problems, that walk in terms of urban landscape areas, but you learn a lot from the land just by walking that little bit of it. And if you're in the country, it's wonderful. If you're in PEI, I see somebody who spends their summers on PEI. There is a lot of there are beautiful walks there along country roads. So the main thing is just go out and walk. But if you are interested in I mean, my recommendation from my own particular background is that if you're interested in a walk a longer walk in Canada of some sort, that you try and seek out a group that may already be doing it, or attach yourself to a group rather than doing the kind of long solitary walk. Now, I have a good friend, Ken Wilson, who is his book, Walking the Bypass, is just about to come out from University of Regina Press. And it is about urban walking, well, and country walking in Regina. And he is a solitary walker. So, I mean, he would maybe make an argument more for that. But for me, it's always been valuable to have the company and to learn from other people as you walk. And especially if you're going to do a walk like that. Now, there are groups all across the country that do walk. So practically, um, there are there's a in Quebec there's a group that walks from, say, Montreal to Saint-Anne-de-Beaupré, which is a very long walk. But you have to register for it. There is a circular walk around Saint-Benoît-du-Lac, which is a really lovely walk. I haven't done it, but I know friends who have. Out west, Camino, Manitoba, takes leads walks very, very often. Not just in Winnipeg, primarily in Winnipeg, but in sort of southern Manitoba. In Saskatchewan, the Saskatchewan History and Folklore Society, on their website, have a trail walks um, tab on their website. And by contacting them, you can be put on a mailing list in case of a walk. This last summer, there were walks in the grasslands parks. So not the big, long linear walk, but still some very interesting walks. Here in Nova Scotia, where I am, Camino Nova Scotia takes walks. And PEI, there was a group that PEI pilgrimage that for a very reasonable amount, I think it was $300 or $400, you can walk with them for a week across eastern PEI. A beautiful, beautiful walk. And then, of course, there is a trail all the way around PEI, but you have to do a little bit of logistical work on that. And then in British Columbia, I mean, it's built for walking through BC pretty much. So I'm primarily talking about the south now. If you are if you're interested, yeah, I see somebody said I did the Saint Anne de Beaupré walk starting at Trois Rivières. Yeah, you do not necessarily have to start in Montreal. And there's also a walk from Ottawa to Montreal, by the way, that is sometimes done. Um, there's a walk up the Grand River in southwestern Ontario, the Midlands. There's a kind of a walk there with Catholic groups. They're who walk basically in the Haudenosaunee territories there. And so there are these, if you research it, you can almost always find a local walk. So I think I've answered Beth, and
Yes.
thanks for the
And
question.
have you done any cross-border connection, or do you know of anything similar taking place in the United States?
Um, I'm sure that they are happening. There are indigenous-led walks on the American prairies. The Dakota 30, if you're interested in learning something about the largest mass execution in the United States, which, by the way, interestingly and tragically, the largest mass executions on both sides of the border were of indigenous people, men. So on the American side, look up the movie Dakota 38. It's Dakota and then 38. And that will tell you about a winter pilgrimage that took place for many years. I'm not sure if it still is. Um, if you Google the Pilgrimage Institute at William and Mary University, or the College of William and Mary in Virginia, and they have a Pilgrimage Institute which has a convention or a seminar in the fall every November. Very, very interesting and full of people who are talking about all kinds of pilgrimage in the States. And lovely. If you ever go there, talk to George Greenia. He is kind of the doyen, the grandfather of communal pilgrimage, but also many other kinds of pilgrimage. And of course, there are the people who walk the Long Trail in Vermont, or the Appalachian Trail and so on. And some of them see it as pilgrimage, and some of them just see it as a long walk.
Hmm. I want to give voice to another question as well, which is about your encounters along the way. And the question is partly about discipleship and understanding that Jesus walked. So I wonder, it's sort of two questions, but one is, how did the walking and the pilgrimage that you describe here, how does it change your own faith, your own discipleship, your own following of Jesus? But then maybe I should ask this separately, but a separate question is, you have some nice stories in here in the Good Walk about meeting people along the way, including talking to other settler descended people and talking about what you've learned. How did those conversations unfold? That's two totally different questions, but take them in any order you want.
Yeah, sure. Well, maybe I'll start with the second first and then ask you again about the
Yeah,
first.
sure. That's right. I'll try to
Um,
remember it.
I mean, one of the things about living in Nova Scotia that I've discovered is that people here in Nova Scotia take a lot more time to chat with you. If you bump into people, you'll talk. And that doesn't happen so much in Montreal, always where people are maybe in more of a hurry. But when we were walking, we were always making contact with people because for a couple of things. Partly, if we just bumped into people, we were making contact. And then one of the great things about pilgrimage is that the pilgrim, I mean, it's hard to distinguish a pilgrim and a tourist because what happens is you move back and forth between one and the other role. But in general, a pilgrim is somebody who receives the gift of hospitality from others and is thankful for what they get. And so, for instance, in our walks, we would at the first couple of walks, we would tent in farmers' yards, and we never knew what was happening. We never knew if we were going to be making our own meals, which would be fine. And we were one of the interesting things was that I walked with expired British Army rations, and so I was always interested in what was in these envelopes that I had dropped off the back of a truck, kind of into my backpack. But um, but very often we would land at one of these farms, and sometimes we'd be offered lemonade, or we'd be offered. Sometimes we were offered a full meal, but many times we weren't because it was maybe harvest and they were busy, and that was fine. Being a pilgrim meant that you kind of adopt the ethos, the character of being grateful for what you're given. It's a kind of a mendicant position, frankly, and it's a good place for us to be when we are so used to everything on demand, and getting what we want. I mean, there's only a certain kind of tea I want to drink normally at home, or a certain kind of whatever. But when I'm a pilgrim, if somebody offers me, some other kind of tea or something else, I mean, I'm happy for that. And that is a learning that comes from pilgrimage as well. So that's kind of that. And then also we learned from the First Nations that we were hosted by occasionally, not often, because there just weren't that many on our route. But we were hosted by First Nations, and we learned something from them about their experience of the history so they told their side of the story in some ways. And by hearing that story, then we see another point of view. And it's not a point of view that necessarily we would have come across otherwise. Um, or even in Saskatchewan, the point of view of very small town people sometimes who are grieving the loss of communities that happen with growing agribusiness and the sale of land to absolutely huge agribusiness. And so what's happened is that the kind of communities that my grandparents and my parents grew up in no longer exist. They've been plowed under, and those little communities are gone. And so you learn something about that too. Interestingly, I've forgotten her name right now. There's an indigenous scholar who talked about the fact that calling people settlers when they've so quickly moved back off the land is kind of a misnomer in some ways because the indigenous people were there for thousands of years, and the Europeans, at least in the West, came in, were there for 100 years, and are mostly gone from the little communities now. So
Hmm.
it's kind of ironic.
So, just to follow up on this before I go back and ask you my first question again, uh, you tell some stories, maybe not about things you did along the walk, but talks that you've given about this, and we talked earlier about unhomeness, and another word that you use is unsettling, right? That part of the telling new stories in Canada is about feeling awkward or feeling unsettled about the past. but that's not always a comfortable feeling to have. Uh, so how do you uh, get to a place where you can share the learning and the new stories that you're learning with other people who maybe haven't had the same experience or uh, aren't quite as receptive to wanting to hear that?
Yeah. Well, sometimes it's hard. Sometimes people don't want you to. I mean, when we were walking to Battleford, because it was the period of time when there was the trial for the killing of the young, uh,
Colton Bushy?
yeah, Colton Boushie. Thank you. Um, there were more and more no trespassing signs that we hit, and farmers would come along, and it was interesting because this tells you something about settlement too. A farmer would come along sometime, not, I mean, most farmers were very, very welcoming. I want to say that. But very rarely we had a farmer who would come along and say, I don't want you on my land. I don't even want you to picnic in the ditches on my land. Well, as I say in the book, I think the ditch wasn't his. The ditch is not his to claim. So, I mean, right away, that tells you something about sometimes when we're feeling so defensive and angry, we overreach ourselves. I mean, the ditch is public property. And of course, for us, we could sit and have lunch in the ditch and be this group primarily of people who look like me, sort of aging white people, and with a couple of indigenous faces in there, and we would feel safe. I mean, because I'm because of who I am. If you walk through much of the world with a credit card and a cell phone, you feel fine. But I mean, the indigenous folks who were with us said, we would never do this by ourselves. We would never sit in this ditch and have our lunch, on a tarp because we would not feel safe doing that. And so you learn that as you're going with them. So how do you, but at the same time, there were sometimes people who seemed a little bit, who wondered about our walk and the point of it. But what would happen is that they would be invited in, and Richard, who I talked about earlier, the man who walked with us, he was so good at just welcoming people into the circle, and then there'd be a smudge. And you could see that they were uncomfortable a bit with the smudge. But by the time it was done, I can't count how many times there would be a local farmer it was clearly the first time that they had gone through a smudge. And by the end of it, they were kind of going, wow, that wasn't bad. And that was kind of, you could see the smile on their face and and that they felt good about this little tiny step that they had taken. Because very often that anger or resentment actually comes out of a fear of, am I going to lose something? Am I going to lose something? And indigenous people are not, I mean, I can't speak for indigenous people, but I kept hearing again and again, like some friends of mine who would say, we're not expecting me, for instance, to go back to Norway. I'm not Norwegian. I can't go back to Norway. I'm Canadian. This is it. The cities aren't going to disappear overnight or anything like that. But the more that settler descendants like myself can recognize the arrangements, the treaties by which we live here, our creation story, then we can have a spirituality of being more open to the people who were here before. Which, by the way, comes back to the question of, did I make disciples on the way? I think I became more of a disciple on the way. I'm more like the rich young man, who was told to give up a few things and follow Jesus.
Just a
Um,
few.
yeah, well, he was told more, but in my case, to give up a few things and follow Jesus. It's interesting that we didn't plan it this way, but there was a United Church minister, a Lutheran or a United Church lay minister, a Lutheran, two Lutheran ministers on the one walk, and a Roman Catholic archbishop, who were all part of this group walking. And ecumenically, the only thing we could all do together was smudge.
Hmm.
What does that tell you?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, so, uh, well, I think you did just get to that first question I was asking. Um, so I wonder if I can ask you a different question. We're talking about this idea of pilgrimage, about a kind of relationship with the land, of learning it in new ways. And so far, we've been speaking about pilgrimage as a physical geographic experience, lacing up your boots and getting out there. But you've been quite open about the fact that in just about a year ago you had a stroke quite unexpectedly, as strokes are, and that I wonder if I can just ask you to maybe share a little bit about that experience and how that helps you think about pilgrimage as well, or if the idea of pilgrimage is helpful to thinking about that.
Yeah, the second part first, I guess, is that, yeah, it's amazing how many people, like I had a wonderful outpouring of support. Like, it was a major stroke. I was not sure I would ever be able to walk again. I was a two-person transfer for maybe a couple weeks, which meant that it took two people to carry me to the bathroom. Um, and uh, and I remember how wonderful it was when it only took one person to take me to the bathroom, because anybody who's been long term in hospital knows that it's hard to get two staff members into your room at the same time for anything, and if you have to pee, that's hard, So it was very much like a stroke. I'm sorry, it was a stroke. It was very much like a pilgrimage in many ways, and I was amazed how many people told me you're on a new kind of a pilgrimage now. And it felt like that. Many of the same things. The liminality. Liminality means not being here or there, being in between states. And when you've had a stroke and you don't know what your recovery will be, that is a very liminal place to be. And of course, communitas, it means community. And that has been an important part of my many walking pilgrimages. But it was absolutely community that helped me do have as much recovery as I have now. Now, I should say, many people on this call know me and know that I have not recovered. Um, I have not recovered fully, so I would not be able to walk 350 kilometers or anywhere close to that now, or even the 25 kilometers that I walked the day before I had my stroke. Um, but but I am able to walk some, and I don't, the length, I mean, as fun as it is to say that you walk 350 kilometers, the pilgrimage is in the experience, not the distance necessarily. And so I don't think that pilgrimage should be just a metaphor, especially we who are Protestants should avoid using pilgrimage as a metaphor too often, because for a long time that's all it's been, is a metaphor, and nobody's actually ever put their boots on and walked anywhere. Um,
Pilgrim's Progress.
yes, that's
I
right.
mean, the classic bestseller of Protestantism. Yes, I
That's
know.
right.
Did John Bunyan ever lace up his boots?
No,
Probably.
and Luther, who famously kind of said pilgrimage is awful. It's a papist thing. It's Catholic, and don't do it. But he uses the image of pilgrimage all the time, which I think was completely ironic. So I think that the best thing to do is actually do something physical, like actually do walk. But of course, there are other ways of making pilgrimage. You can limp a pilgrimage. You can bike a pilgrimage. Um,
Horseback.
you can horseback. Yeah, somebody said the horseback.
Yes. Yep.
Absolutely. Um, and I am looking forward to still walking some. I have, my recovery continues slowly but surely, and I'm hoping to be able to walk. I did actually for the 10th anniversary of the walk in the good walk in the book. I was out in Saskatchewan this last summer, and it was the first time that I went on a long trip without Sarah, my wife, kind of helping me all the way along. And I was able to walk about a mile and a half, I would say, something like that, about 3 kilometers, almost 3 kilometers, up and down prairie trails. And then I was done. That was it.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
it was a start.
Uh, So, I mean, this is here's a question that has been sent to me that I think fits into this conversation, and I want to give voice to it right now. And it's appropriate for you, I think, because as you say, you are an academic and you've written a lot about pilgrimage. Uh, it- you know, in your view, what accounts for the popularity of pilgrimage right
Mm.
now, or the increasing popularity? Things like the Camino, Santiago. the St. Cuthbert's Way, St. Olaf's Way. Again, if you want to learn more about these places, Matthew has a great podcast series that you can listen to. But where does that fit into this conversation?
I think it offers several things for us. One is that, again, like your book, it offers us a kind of a fairly easy way to meditate. Like, I don't like sitting in one place and meditating with necessarily. I'm not necessarily good at it. But walking, I naturally fall into a place where your brain starts to, to think through things and to regurgitate things. And many of us are the same way. Walking is it's the conscious activity which is most closest to unconscious for the able-bodied.
Hmm.
If you are fairly able-bodied, like able to walk, walking is the kind of conscious activity that requires the least brain power, so that then therefore the heart and the brain are free to bubble up thoughts and work through things. And I think that's part of its appeal. I also think that in our society, which tends to isolate us and put us onto little screens on our phones or on our laptops or whatever. The idea of being on a trail and meeting people in community is partly what makes the Camino so enticing to people, I think. That's a part of it. The people that you meet as you go. And it's a kind of, you don't know who you're going to meet. You're really at the mercy of the cohort that's starting out that day. And so there's a kind of a community aspect there uh, that is there, and the spirituality of it. As so, all of the things that you've mentioned, I think that's a part of it. And then for people of a certain age, my age and slightly younger and slightly older, um, it is a hardship without being a triathlon. Um, it's not easy, but frankly, it's not that difficult either. I mean, it's if you're fortunate enough to be able-bodied, you strap on a pair of boots. The most important thing is your footwear. You do not have to be in super shape to walk a fairly good distance. You just have to be bullheaded a little bit, and you have to be willing to put up with the boredom and learn from it. And you have to take your time. That's it. So I think it's got a low entry level. It is spiritual. It's good for the body, and it's good for the heart. I think there are many, many reasons why it has kind of had a renaissance. And it's a great way of seeing another place. Like when we walked through Norway, which was one of the, I haven't written a book about the Norwegian walk, but I did do a pilgrimage episode about it on the podcast. When we walked through Norway, it was astounding just to see the Norwegian countryside from your feet. I mean, it's really gorgeous. And of course, Spain is the same way, the Meseta, and so many beautiful spots there. And many more people are taking the walk, the Francigena, through northern Italy and up through there and down toward Rome. I mean, if you don't, I mean, the only problem there is it's so hot for much of the year, but there are many, many great places where the beauty is astounding. And I think it appeals to our sense of beauty as well.
Uh, Thank you. And thank you for these questions. There are a couple more that are being sent directly to me. But if people want to give voice to questions in their own voice, feel free to use the raise your hand function. One question that's come directly to me. Uh, do you have an estimate on how many kilometers you've walked in all of your pilgrimages together?
I don't, thousands,
Yeah.
but I don't know. I have worn out two pairs of boots.
Okay.
And
That's
I should have gotten rid of the first pair earlier. In the
yeah.
book, I talk about I developed a quite severe leg infection on one of my walks because there was no place at night to clean the blisters.
Hmm.
So yeah, you have to remember to get rid of to change your footwear
Hmm.
before it becomes too much.
Hmm.
So thousands of kilometers, um, and I've enjoyed every kilometer, I bet. I think.
Yeah.
I mean, the only problem with, I will say that one of the only problems with walking is that you can't correct a mistake as quickly.
Hmm.
So if you are, I noticed this when I was walking in Northern England to Holy Island from Melrose, Scotland, across the Borders region to Holy Island, Lindisfarne. what would happen would be that I would miss, it happened a couple of times where I missed a marker, and you'll maybe go, a couple of kilometers, and it on foot, boy, correcting that mistake takes a long time. Yeah.
Yeah. So since we're in the British Isles, let me transition then and ask you about the newest book you've written, which is called Someone Else's Saint: How a Scottish Pilgrimage Led to Nova Scotia. It's about uh, a saint with a great name, Ninian. And maybe you could tell us about how that book came to be and how it fits in with some of the themes that we've been talking about this evening.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's two walks in Someone Else's Saint. It's published by Pottersfield Press 2025. But it talks about two different walks. The first one was in 2019 with, again, this Ken Wilson that I mentioned earlier, with whom I've walked many kilometers, um, and others, and Sarah and Christine Ramsey. We were the first group of Canadians to walk from Glasgow south toward Whithorn, so southwest tip of Scotland, and to Ninian. And I had had for many years an ongoing debate with Sarah Thoreau at Concordia University, Montreal, about St. Ninian. St. Ninian is a bit like a Robin Hood or a King Arthur. You know, people aren't 100% sure that he actually existed. And I wasn't 100% sure that he existed, but I thought since we were in England at the time, Sarah and I thought, let's take this walk to Ninian and we will enjoy Southwest Scotland, which, as it turned out to be extremely wet during that walk that we took. And we'll learn something about Ninian. So I learned quite a bit about Ninian on that way. And then I wrote about that. I journaled about it and I thought about it and I wrote some text about it. And then what happened was that in 2022, Sarah and I were in Dublin in Ireland, and and Sarah got a job here in northern Nova Scotia in Antigonish at St. FX, St. Francis Xavier University. So we're Googling, as one does, we're Googling where are we going to live if we move here? And we're Googling Antigonish, and we see the cathedral is called St. Ninian. And Sarah said to me, well, you're going to have to do something about that. That's such a weird coincidence. And so what happened was that over the course of some time, then I developed the idea of walking a very short walk. It was 25 kilometers from Palmcourt Beach, which is not far from where I am right now in the ocean, to St. Ninian Cathedral here, and then comparing these two walks and the communities that developed in these places. And it's interesting because there are very strong links, of course, between Nova Scotia and Southwest Scotland and Scotland overall, and between the Ninians of these places. But the walk, even the 25-kilometer walk here, along mostly secondary roads, helps to identify the indigenous, the Mi'kmaq population of this area, the Acadian. We live in an Acadian area that's on that route, and the history of the Acadians, and the Gaels, the Gaelic-speaking Scots, and it was just amazing how many, not coincidentally, how many links there were back and forth, and thinking about Saint Ninian. So it was good to write the book, and it was also an exercise in learning how wherever you are. So if you're in Sudbury, say, I mean, I don't know, but if you're in Sudbury, I bet you there is a walk in Sudbury somewhere that you can take that will develop your sense of the local history of the place, the indigenous history of the place, and also links to, I know in Sudbury, maybe to the Finnish community or to the British community or Ukrainian or something else. I'm not sure. So I think that the universal is always in the local. You can always find the universal in the local, and wherever you might be, you can always find something about the universal. I see that one of the comments in the Diocese of Kootenay, province of BC and Yukon, this is Kathy, we have been having a number of pilgrimages and one major pilgrimage at Sorrento for the past 5 years. So there's one in BC. And by the way, in Alberta, there's St. Anne's. I forgot about that, the Indigenous pilgrimage to St. Anne's in northern Alberta. And in northern Saskatchewan, around Batoche, there's an Indigenous pilgrimage also called it's slipping my mind right now, but it is around Batoche. I think it's Lac St. Joseph, maybe, something like that.
So Just side question. As a result of writing a book about Saint Ninian, have you decided if he existed or not?
Oh, I think he did. And this was, yeah, thank you. This is one of the benefits of walking is that you see things when you know how I mentioned the all of the teepee rings. And so you learn how the prairie was populated. Well, here in Scotland, when finally we got to the cave, Ninian's Cave, you could look across. It happened to be one of the clear days. We were blessed with clear days at the very end. You can see the peaks of the Lake District in England, and you can see the Isle of Man, and you can see northern Scotland. I mean Northern Ireland sometimes, depending on where you are, if you're high enough. So when you're looking across the Solway Firth at England, the idea that there would have been a Celtic Briton bishop who was sent north, it's not hard to think at all. I mean, if you can see it, that means they were traveling and trading back and forth. And so the walk was a really easy way to learn something about that. It's by the way, it's true in biblical studies. I had an Israeli student one time who came to me after a class that I gave about the Sea of Galilee, and he said to me, Professor, I don't think the Sea of Galilee is as big as you seem to think it is. And because I'm a Canadian, and so when I think sea, and you hear the stories about the disciples on the waves, thinking this massive body of water. Well, the first time that I actually looked out over the Lake of Tiberias or Sea of Galilee, you realize for a Canadian, it's not even a big lake. And and so walking or being present somewhere, it really does help you, as it did with Ninian in Southwest Scotland.
Mhm. Hmm. Um, Thank you. We're coming close to the end of our time here, and there's maybe to bring this conversation in to land. Um, I am aware that, here we are in Canada. It's October 1st. It's the week in which Canadians mark the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, Orange Shirt Day. You're wearing an orange shirt. This was yesterday, of course. Uh, and, we're a decade after the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its calls to action. Uh, and I think, in large measure, this is part of what the Good Walk is about, and about what your writing and ministry more generally is about how we relate, we who are settler descended people relate with Indigenous peoples of Canada, of Turtle Island, and I mean, how do you, I mean, that's a huge topic. It's an ongoing one, of course. You talk about the importance in your writing about humility, about learning the truth about the past. We've been speaking about that a little bit, uh, and also about the importance of being reborn, I guess, in our treaty relations. Um, you know, I- as we think about 10 years after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in this week of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, what guidance or thoughts or reflections do you have to offer, from the perspective of pilgrimage, but just more generally as well?
Well, I don't know if it's guidance necessarily, but it's about stance. You know how I talked about the when you're in a pilgrim, you kind of accept what you're given if you're in the pilgrimage mode. And there's a kind of a um, I always realize this. I used to realize this with Richard when I worked with him and with Ray sometimes, and that is that there's no rushing certain things. Uh, my experience with the indigenous folk that I've worked with has been pretty constantly that I'm in a hurry to do something, and it doesn't get done quickly because they're not in a hurry for that. And then if they are in a hurry, that's on their time, and that puts you in a kind of a position again of I'm not in charge. So I think that it's about a stance in this case, developing a stance where you say. Um, Okay, I'm not in charge. I mean, I wish that uh, in terms of truth and reconciliation, people will sometimes say to me, well, how should we move toward reconciliation? Well, I don't even know. I've heard Indigenous people say this on the radio, at least, And that is that there's no, let's not even talk about reconciliation. Let's just keep focused on truth. And what might happen is that if we dance around with truth long enough, we may find that that reconciliation has taken place. But let's not actually say we want that now because that's kind of presumptive on our parts. Let's just keep doing the truth thing. And so I think that's the kind of strategy that I've tried to work with, which is always, what's the truth about this place? So where I live now, what's the truth about the Mi'kmaq and the Bugnageg is a First Nation very close to me, and we go and we buy our gas there, and we don't presume to kind of push in and say we're going to do this or that. We're just trying to very gradually develop relations as we can, and it takes years sometimes. Like it doesn't happen all at once. And like any group, I mean, Indigenous folks are not all the same. They don't have all the same ideas about you or me. Um, some are more open, some are less open. Most First Nations are like small towns where they only trust you after you've been there 2 generations or something like that. So it's kind of I think it's a kind of very slow, organic relationship building. And one of the first ways to do that is buy, if there's a store or if you're catering something, why not check out like pay the extra for an Indigenous caterer, buy products from Indigenous people online, some great soap around Montreal. Do that kind of thing. Develop the kind of organic ties that come from just the day-to-day things that we do. That's not much. That's not spiritual, but sometimes the spiritual consists in who we buy our soap from and whether we've actually been somewhere. And by the way, Ray always says, go to the powwows. They're intended to that is it's meant to be a place where non-Indigenous people are welcome. And so you're not impinging on anybody if you go to a powwow. That's you're allowed to be there, and it's a great place to be, and it's wonderful to see it and participate in it. I don't know if
Great.
that answers that
Yeah,
question.
yeah. No, it's a great piece of advice. Well, maybe let me just ask you, is there anything else I should ask you about, or anything else you want to share while we still have you on the line, as it were?
Uh, I'm oh I'm not really well. I am writing, of course. I'm trying to write.
Oh,
Of course,
yes, the next book.
my left hand is starting to get to the place where I can type slowly, but this finger I broke it playing basketball many times, and it's getting in the way of my learning how to type again with my left hand. But the good news is that I'm actually able to use a few fingers to type now on my left hand, and my right hand is still fine. And so I am thinking about composing and some things. And I wrote a kind of a more humorous thing called Cat Daddery about becoming friends with cat ladies and the beings that they love. That I'm hoping at some point will find a publisher. And and I am, of course, being a writer, I'm probably going to turn. I have already thought about turning my stroke experience up to the moment into a kind of a book about stroke because a lot of us are having strokes. I mean, there are people, many people having strokes, unfortunately, and um, and anybody who's for whatever reason been hospitalized for a long time knows that experience of the nurse coming in, moving the table over to the side so that they can take your blood pressure, and then walking out of the room, and you're stuck with no access to the things that you need for the next hour and no way of getting to it. I mean, this is a common problem for, thousands of people, but I'm hoping to put some of that into writing and maybe share some of the experiences I had with that.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you. And I want to say big thank you to Matthew. We began, I'll just hold it up here, the book, The Good Walk, Creating New Paths on Traditional Prairie Trails, which came out last year. You can see I've got it bookmarked here. And then the other book I mentioned was Our Home and Treaty Land, written with Ray Aldred. And Matthew, you had the newer edition there with a more colorful cover.
Yeah.
There's other books. They're all available in the usual places. I did say one of the wonderful things that my students like about our home in treaty land is that it's a thin book. The word I prefer is accessible. The Good Walk is a little bit thicker and all the richer for it. So thank you for that. Yes.
Jesse, can I say one thing about pairings, which
Oh
is
yeah.
because only because this book, God bless the Catholics who Novalis Press, who took on my very first book. But I will say that it's very, very hard to get this book. It's of all the books that I've written, this is the only one that's quite difficult to find in a bookstore or online. If you ever are interested in it, the whole point of this book, I know it sounds a bit odd, but the whole point of this book is basically what drink would you have if you were reading this text, if you were reading
Mhm.
this particular passage of scripture? And there's an
Yes.
alcoholic drink and a non-alcoholic drink paired with various passages of scripture. And so if anybody's ever interested in this book in particular, you should just contact me and I'd be happy to send you one. It makes for a great Bible study, by the way, book if you are in charge of a parish or have anything to do with a parish. And I just wanted to put a pitch in for that because this is the one that's not available otherwise very easily.
And it's also been translated into French, I think.
Yes, that's right.
Correct?
So
Yes.
Apocalypse Gin Tonic.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Let me just say to wrap up that one thing we've been speaking about a little bit this evening is about the importance of place and the land and where we are. For those of you who want to explore that further, we are offering an online preaching workshop this fall called Preaching from Our Place, taught by Jeffrey Metcalf, an Anglican priest in Quebec City, and also somebody who's thought a lot about place. And so, much as Matthew is doing this evening, thinking about how we come to understand our place and how that affects our proclamation of the Christian faith. If you're interested in that, or if you're interested in other online courses that we have coming up, I'm going to put in the chat screen right now a link to our website here at Montreal Diocesan Theological College. Some of the other online courses we have coming up, including, of course, this fall on the history of the church in Canada, which again we'll be thinking about the relationship of Christians with Indigenous peoples and other parts of church history as well. So that's coming up in a couple weeks. We are on the verge of announcing the next one of these Principal Meets Author events. It's going to be with Dr. Hannah Reichel. We're going with an American this time. Hannah Reichel teaches at Princeton, but has just published a very accessible, meant for a popular audience devotional called For Such a Time as This, an emergency devotional. Thinking about Christian faith at this particular moment in history. And we will hope to have advertising material up about that soon, but hope to do that before Christmas time. So all that stuff is online, and if you don't get our emails, you can sign up for those as well. But I want to thank you all for being part of this conversation this evening and for contributing your thoughts. And Matthew, I'm so glad that this worked out to spend time together. And thank you for sharing so much of yourself and of your writing with us.
Oh, it was such a pleasure. Thank you, Jesse, for those great questions. And thank you to friends old and new. It's so nice to see all these faces. Really, really appreciate your presence here. Thank you.
So have a great evening, everybody. Go in peace and keep reading and keep walking. Right. Thank you, Matt. That was great.
Yeah, thank you. And so nice to see Dennis. Nice to see you.
Hey, good man. I wish I'd encourage everybody to read everyone else's saints.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
it's a wonderful read, and the adventures in Scotland or something else.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Well, we'll
Here,
keep following you on Facebook.
All right. And likewise, likewise.
Ciao.